So we already have 40 and counting.
Yeah, I'll give it another minute or so. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff Shear. I'm the president of the REIC, and it's a couple minutes after 12, and I know people will continue to file in, but we'll go ahead and get started so we can get this completed within the hour. Welcome to another REIC webcast. Today, we are pleased to have Ryan Severino with us. Ryan is the chief economist for JLL, and he is going to talk a little bit about the macroeconomic effects on the economy as a result of COVID-19, and also touch a little bit on how that's going to affect commercial real estate moving forward. Before I let Ryan start, though, a couple of quick announcements for the REIC. I think most of you should have received an email by now, but unfortunately we've had to postpone the clay shooting event, which was scheduled for this Friday. You know, with the uptick of COVID-19 cases locally, the board just made a decision that it was best to postpone that event for now, and we will try to reschedule it in the near future. Also, as many of you probably know, July is the month that we typically hold our summer social. That will almost certainly not happen in its traditional form, but we will continue. You know, this virus keeps throwing us curveballs, but we're continuing to try to be nimble enough to deal with it and continue to try to bring quality content and give you some value for your REIC membership. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Julia Silva. Julia is as most of you know, is a past president of the REIC and a longtime board member, and is also a colleague of Ryan's at JLL. And Julia will properly introduce Ryan. Thanks very much. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Definitely excited to introduce our esteemed speaker. And I want to thank the board for being so innovative. It's so hard to continue to bring quality branding to our members in this scenario, but we're doing everything we can, and we were so grateful to have Ryan join us. Also, thanks to Sherry Smith for helping the board and guiding us and making sure we're still bringing quality programming to our membership. Ryan Severino is in high demand. I had the honor of hearing him speak at 4 of our markets in Florida back in March, and I just loved his energy. In fact, Ryan and I spoke earlier, and I said, you know, we're from the Northeast, so we get excited, and there's a little bit of a lag in the video conferencing, so you have to kind of slow down your speech a little bit, so I try to do the same. But you're going to feel just as excited as I did when I heard him. Ryan Severino joins us. He's with JLL, so I love promoting our brand clearly, but I'm not that selfish. He really is good at this. He's our senior economist and director of research, our chief economist, and manages our economics team. He's responsible for global and regional economics research, analysis, and forecasting, as well as property market forecasting. Prior to that, Ryan was senior economist and director of research at REIC. He also served as associate director of research at MetLife Real Estate Investments, so we all know these names, familiar with them. Ryan also currently serves as an adjunct professor of finance and economics at Columbia University and NYU. He teaches courses as urban economics, portfolio and risk management, microeconomics, macroeconomics. He also has pre-experience in real estate asset management, portfolio management, and acquisitions, We talked earlier about how industrial used to be the most boring asset class we ever had to work on, and now it is the belle of the ball. So I'm super excited. My role at JLL is Managing Director for Florida for investment sales, industrial specifically. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Ryan, and we are pleased to have you. Thank you for joining us, and off to the races, Ryan. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, everybody, for having me today. It is a really auspicious time to be talking about the economy, and I entitled this presentation specifically a certain way. I know there are at least a few people who have heard me present before, and I'm very fond of saying that the two most dangerous thoughts in economics are "this time is different" and "that will never happen again," except this time really is different. And the reason that it's different is that we find ourselves in a pandemic-driven downturn, and that's not something that we've seen historically, at least not in the modern era of economics. Normally, if there's a pandemic or an epidemic, it might be concurrent to a downturn at worst, but it often doesn't show up in the economic data. That is clearly not the case this time around. These are the things that I want to discuss today. I want to set the stage and talk about the defining features of the economic landscape, just so that we're all on the same page and we know where we're coming from with this. I want to talk about my approach to trying to peer into the crystal ball and figure out where the world is going. It is even more challenging than it normally is in more benign economic times. So I will discuss how I'm addressing that. I also want to take a longer term perspective. When you're in the throes of something like this, it can be a little bit difficult to take a step back and think about the bigger picture, but I am getting some questions about that. So I want to make sure that we address that at least partially. I also want to make sure that we don't forget about the key risks. There are some that are lurking out there, so I want to make sure that everybody's aware of them. This is definitely a point in time where we don't have a shortage of risks, but I'll focus on some of the key ones that I think are worth paying attention to. And then lastly, I just want to discuss broad implications for different property types. What I mean by that is from an economist's point of view, not from an asset manager's point of view or an acquisitions point of view, simply thinking of it with my economist hat on. These are the defining features of the economic landscape as I see it right now. I want to start in the upper left with that abrupt halt. What I mean by abrupt halt is that we had a very screeching end to a lot of economic activity in the first half of March when we started shutting down and locking down certain parts of the economy. That's not normally what we see in a downturn. Normally in a downturn, it starts kind of slowly. The data looks a little ambiguous, it starts to weaken a little bit, then it starts to accelerate, and then we find ourselves in a downturn. We don't normally find ourselves cruising along at the equivalent of 40 to 50 miles per hour in the economy and then slamming on the brakes. And that is really what we did. So this is unusual in the sense that the pandemic caused us to abruptly halt a lot of the economic activity that was occurring. As a consequence of that, you are getting what I am terming unusual data. What I mean by unusual data is that when we first went into lockdown, the data releases were really not useful. They were old, they were stale, they reflected an economy that didn't exist any longer because of that abrupt halt. Since then, we've gotten data that I would generally categorize as being overly severe. I'm not trying to scaremonger or rile anyone up. I actually think I'm doing the opposite, or at least trying to do the opposite, in saying kind of what we expected. It's par for the course. If you are going to shut off a significant percentage of the economy, then you are going to see data results that look relatively severe. But I'll talk about them in their proper context. Those things together are producing what I am calling questionable forecast reliability. I often say that during the best of times, my job is the equivalent of throwing mathematical darts at a board. Right now, it's the equivalent of doing that in the dark, wearing a blindfold, in a smoke-filled room with one arm tied behind my back, and the rock or somebody is holding my other arm back, trying to keep me from even throwing a dart at the board. So I will discuss how I'm generally addressing that. Given all of this unusual nature in the economy, the questionable forecast reliability, the government has stepped in a very large way. And I'm not taking a stance on whether you should like government or not like government. I'm simply saying the government realized that this is a serious problem. And on both the monetary policy side with the Fed and the fiscal policy side with the federal government, they stepped in in both an absolute and a relative to the size of the economy way to try to keep this from worsening, because government policy is not going to be able to fix this. Fed policy alone, fiscal policy alone cannot fix this situation, but they can at least put a safety net under it. They can at least dampen the impact of some of it, which brings me to the last point, which also harkens back to where I started with this. To a large extent, the pandemic is going to dictate the cycle. The pandemic is going to tell us how quickly we can get out of this when it's actually over. Definitely different this time around. So unlike typical downturns where government policy can maybe pull us, or at least help to pull us out of something, government policy can blunt the impact right now. But until we get some kind of resolution on the health situation, it's really only going to be so effective. That brings me to this slide, which is really the transmission mechanism that got us into this. And I don't want to spend a lot of time dwelling on that. I think everyone generally knows that. But I want to bring it up because how we got into this is also how we are going to get out of this. Start over on the left side with the health crisis. We had a health crisis that was starting to potentially spiral beyond the capacity of the health system to actually contain it or at least deal with it. As a consequence of that, it changed what I'm calling the political state of play. Government officials stepped in, started locking down, shutting down certain parts of the economy, asked people to stay at home. As a consequence of that, it changed what I'm calling human behavior. And I don't just mean consumer behavior, how we work, how we live, how we play, all of those things. All of that together has obviously had a deleterious impact on the economy, which consequently is having an impact at least on some commercial real estate markets. You go back over to the left side of this slide, you could see where the government policy response is trying to intervene. On the health crisis, I mean not just keeping it from spiraling out of control, but actually funding things like equipment that frontline healthcare workers need, providing funding for vaccine research and development, those kinds of endeavors. They're clearly the ones who are dictating the political state of play, so you probably don't need me to elaborate on that. And then human behavior, not just telling us what we can and can't do, but also providing guidance and help around what we should be doing once we're out and about re-engaging in some semblance of what our lives used to look like. The one thing we do have to be cautious about is the potential for a feedback loop, a negative feedback loop, which I've put at the bottom. Because if our behaviors start to cause the health crisis to reignite around different parts of the country, or it's not mutually exclusive, causes politicians to step in and start locking down parts of the economy that maybe they didn't previously, or start re-locking down parts of the economy, then we could get caught in a little bit of a feedback loop that prevents us from getting to the point where the economy improves. Keep your fingers crossed on this, because if the health crisis can even start to improve at the margin, it will change the political state of play, which will enable us to do more of our normal economic activities, and that will certainly have positive benefits for the economy. And I think you're starting to see some of the proverbial green shoots at this point, but we are clearly in a tenuous position right now, so I think it's a little premature to declare anything definitive, certainly a victory. Questionable forecast reliability is a big challenge that I am contending with right now, probably the biggest challenge that I have to face. And this is what I mean by questionable forecast reliability. What I am showing you on this slide is the range of the consensus forecasts for 2020 real US GDP growth over time. And what I mean by consensus range is the difference between the most optimistic forecast and the most pessimistic forecast at the time the forecast was made. So you can see over time, it stays pretty narrow from December to January to February to March, pretty narrow range. And then you can see what happens when we switch from March to April. Not only does the growth forecast downshift dramatically, but that range really widens out, 500, 600, 700 basis points. It's not as if economists who participate in this consensus survey got stupid between March and April, or all of a sudden their models completely started failing. What's happening is that they are having to contend with things that are outside the realm of a normal business cycle. I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't play one on TV, and I certainly didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, yet here I am trying to forecast where the economy is going based on assumptions about a pandemic, and then what government policy is going to do in response to that pandemic, and then how all of us as individuals and households are going to respond to those considerations. I am not foolish or arrogant enough to think that I am somehow superior to all of these other economists who are struggling with this. So I've taken a different approach. My approach has been to say, rather than pin this down to one specific forecast for the economy, I decided to just run a whole bunch of simulations on the economy, quite literally thousands of simulations based on all the permutations and combinations of assumptions I could make about the pandemic, about health policy, about government policy intervention in terms of spending money, locking down parts of the economy, and then assumptions about how readily consumers are going to re-engage in their lives over the balance of this year into next year. My point in showing you this slide is not so much to walk you through all of these bullet points or give you an eye test in the middle of an economic update, except to say these are the kinds of things that I now have to contend with, because if you don't make assumptions, if I'm not willing to make assumptions about these things, then I can't forecast. So I had my model produce thousands of simulations of the economy, and it converged around these three generalized cases: base case, upside case, and downside case. I want to show you how I've been generally thinking about these. The trajectories I'm showing you on this slide represent each of those cases, but I don't want you to think of them as specific point forecasts. Think of them as general guidance. Use them for direction, general magnitude, but I would not hang my hat on these forecasts down to the bullet point, because there is so much uncertainty that we are dealing with because it is different this time around. And to a certain extent, the outlook for the economy is in the eye of the beholder. How optimistic or pessimistic you feel about things right now really determines how you think the economy is going to behave going forward. If you happen to find yourself in the optimistic camp, if your spirit animal is optimism, then the upside case, that black line at the top, is for you. If you think people are going to go back to work relatively quickly, if you think there will not be secondary outbreaks in the fall when cold weather returns, if you think some of the increase in activity that we've seen up to this point doesn't spiral out of control, then you think something along that black line trajectory, a little more optimism is a little more your speed. If you are in the pessimistic camp, if you think that we backslide a little bit because it is starting to spiral out of control again, if you think when cold weather returns to the northern hemisphere that we are going to have problems dealing with this in a wide swath of the country, then something like that gray line trajectory toward the bottom is for you. And if you're a little bit Goldilocks on this, you're not too hot, you're not too cold, or you think we get some kind of mixed bag of good and bad things that come out of it, then that red line base case in the middle, that's up your alley. I think irrespective of how optimistic or pessimistic you feel about this, there are a few key salient things that we can say about what is going on and what's likely to occur. And the first is the title of this slide. I do think we are dealing with pronounced severity right now, irrespective of which exact case we get for the economy going forward. I'm not trying to scaremonger about this, but hearkening back to what I said about the kind of unusual data, severity of the data, we are very likely in for the single worst quarter in US economic history in the second quarter by the time all is said and done. And again, I'm not scaremongering about that. I think that just reflects the kind of economy we have when we have shut so much of it off. And you can see that reflected in each of those lines that trend downward between the first quarter and then where we have those projections for the second quarter. But notice what happens after that. All of those lines, including the gray one at the bottom, start to point upward again. And that means that we are seeing technical growth, at least in the model, in the third quarter of this year. Now, the cynics out there would say, yeah, but we turned so much of the economy off in the first half of the year that turning any meaningful percentage of it back on is almost mathematically guaranteed to produce growth in that period. And I would say, you're right. I would say, yes, simply by dint of mathematics, we should get growth in the third quarter. If it lags a little bit, then by the fourth quarter. But that's not the only reason why I think that we get a relatively quick turnaround. And that's because I've gone back and spent time studying recessions in the United States. What I'm showing you on this slide is the duration of every recession since the Great Depression, which I broadly define as the modern era of economics in the US, so the last 100 years or so. And if you look closely, I have calculated the average, which is about 13 months or so, that red dashed line that I have superimposed on the graph. But if you look even more closely, what you will notice is there are only 4 recessions during that 90, 100 or so year period that actually exceed the average. There's the Great Depression in the late 20s and early 30s. There's the oil crisis recession of the mid-1970s, which I was only alive for the end of, but my parents remind me was thoroughly unpleasant. There is the second Paul Volcker-led recession of the early 1980s, and then there's the Great Recession that we went through really not all that long ago. What all four of those downturns have in common that the others do not is that they are all financially oriented downturns. Obviously, the Great Depression, I think we've all heard stories about that and studied it at some point in our lives, the massive stock market implosion, the runs on banks and bank failures. I don't think you need me to give you a history lesson on that. The oil crisis recession of the 1970s started as an oil embargo, which was a response to a geopolitical event that really had cascading effects in the commodity markets, produced a supply shock to the economy that then spilled over into the equity markets. There's a pretty severe equity downturn in the 1970s. In fact, it's funny, for those of us who have been paying attention to or investing in the equity markets since, say, the early 1980s, we've been the beneficiaries of maybe the greatest bull market in the history of mankind. But I'll generalize a little bit, but if you went back to the 1960s and invested in the stock market and held on to the early 1980s, your returns would probably be about flat. You probably would not have made any money depending upon the specific point in time you got in. And that's largely because of what happened in the 1970s. So oil crisis precipitates commodity market disruption, leads to equity market disruption, leads to prolonged downturn. In the early 1980s, obviously, if Paul Volcker and the Fed are going to raise treasury rates to double digits, with treasuries especially then being the world's benchmark interest rate, then yeah, you are going to have severe disruptions to the financial system. And then the Great Recession, which I think we're all generally still familiar with, it was a balance sheet recession that was centered on the residential real estate market here in the US that basically became a credit crisis that almost imploded the entire global economy. So all financially oriented. If you get away from those, the other recessions on this slide are your kind of plain vanilla typical post-war recession where the Fed probably raised rates a little bit too aggressively, the economy backslid for a quarter or two, and then we went about our business. Those two things, the simple math calculation from the last slide, plus this analysis of historical recessions in the United States, gives me confidence to say that this should be a relatively short downturn despite its severity. The third key salient component of this is once we start to grow again, how long does it take to recover? And by recover, I mean to gain back all of the production that was lost in the economy in the first half of this year. What I'm showing you on this slide on an index basis is my trajectory for my coronavirus, whatever we're going to call this thing, the base case, plotted against the most three recent recessions here in the US. If you compare that red line, that base case that I'm projecting, relative to the other two short recessions, the S&L crisis recession of the early 90s and then the dot-com crisis recession of the early 2000s, you can see the two lines at the top, the gray line and the black line, which are those other short recessions, doesn't take that long to get back up above 100, back up above that previous peak GDP level. It looks more like a, I don't know, like a speed bump than a roadblock compared to the two most recent recessions. It doesn't look like much of a downturn, to be honest. But that's not really what the red line is showing, despite the fact that I do think growth resumes. You can see that red line takes about 9 or 10 quarters to get back to 100, back to the previous level of peak GDP that we had in the fourth quarter of 2019. And that to me looks more like that purplish line toward the middle, which is the trajectory of the Great Recession. The Great Recession, you might recall, took a long time. It took in the neighborhood of about 12-ish, 13-ish quarters for us to gain back all of the productive capacity that was lost in the economy. So even though I expect the technical contraction period to be short, I think the recovery period back is a pretty long, tough slog that we have ahead of us. And there are two key reasons that I think that. Number one is it's relatively easy to produce that third quarter growth spurt just by turning some of the economy back on. But if we are going to limit capacity in a lot of those businesses, stores, bars, restaurants, say 50% for argument's sake, then you're going to limit the ability not just of those businesses to generate revenue, but to go back and hire people. If you're only operating at 50% capacity, you're only going to need about, give or take, 50% of the staff. And that's important because a lot of the most common occupations in the United States, not just industries, but individual occupations, are found in a lot of those businesses. Retail salesperson, checkout clerks, waiters and waitresses, bartenders. those are a lot of plentiful jobs that will struggle to come online if we are limiting the capacity of businesses out of health concerns, because that's how a virus behaves. It's not as if we can incrementally go to 60% capacity and then 70% capacity and then 80% capacity. It's very, very binary. We can turn those businesses back on, but at a limited capacity that follows healthcare guidelines. The second reason that I think the slope of that line is not so steep, that we don't have this kind of proverbial V bounce back, that it is a tougher road, is this data. This is showing you the estimated number of small businesses that have already failed. And when I say already failed, I am simply talking about the period between February and April. Over that 2-month period, you could see that we have lost about 22% of small businesses in the US, which equates to about 3.4 million individual businesses. And that exceeds the entirety from the Great Recession, which lasted 18 months. And I mention that because if these businesses fail to exist, then they will not be around to hire people once the economy starts to recover in the second half of the year. They won't be there to invest. They won't be there to put capital to work. All of those things that are really good about small to medium-sized businesses. So those two things in concert is why I think even though we might start, I think it's likely that we start growing again, third quarter, worst case scenario, maybe fourth quarter. But beyond that, it's going to be a tough road back. When I pull those three individual characteristics together, what you get is you get this kind of hybrid of past recessions, or at least as far as I can look at my base case, which is interesting because even though the downturn is unique in its cause, it's producing individual characteristics that are kind of spliced together from different recessions. What do I mean by that? Let's take those components one at a time. The technical contraction I think we are likely to see in the economy, definitely severe. Even in my base case, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 to 10% peak to trough, something like that. That to me looks more like a pre-war recession. We haven't really seen that kind of contraction in the United States since 1945. We've just gotten better, as difficult as it is, we've gotten better at managing the overall economy in the post-war era. You go back to the pre-war era in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, you're looking at much more severe downturns than what we've typically dealt with since 1945. So most of us haven't seen, even as bad as the last recession was, most of us haven't seen this kind of abject severity in our lifetimes. That said, I do think the technical turnaround should be relatively quick. In all of my scenarios, generally growth resumes by the third quarter. And again, even if I'm off on that a little bit, unless you are talking about the most dire scenarios that my model produced, maybe by the fourth quarter growth resumes. But I'm feeling better and better about that third quarter number as I start to see some signs of life from the economy. Either way, not quibbling over one quarter, this to me looks like a typical non-financially oriented post-war recession, relatively short in nature. So deep, but short. And then that last arrow at the bottom, I lengthened that to make a specific point, the recovery period. I do think for the reasons that I was just discussing, this will be elongated, that it will take more like 9 or 10 quarters to gain back all of the GDP that we have lost during the first half of this year. That is a longer, tougher slog than you might think, given how quickly we could probably turn this around. And in that case, when you splice these together, this looks like this Frankenstein's monster of a recession that doesn't have consistent characteristics with any recession that we've really seen historically, but looks like it's got some bits and pieces here and there of different kinds of recessions that we've kind of spliced together. So it definitely looks different this time around. If I haven't convinced you of that up to this point, let me show you this slide. What I'm showing you on this slide is every recession in the United States since 1948. I didn't pick 1948 at random. 1948 is the year that the BLS created the technical unemployment rate that we still use in the United States today. And when I'm making these kind of time series comparisons, I really try to be consistent about the methodology. We certainly have estimations of the unemployment rate before that, but we don't have the technical calculation. What I'm showing you on this slide for all of those recessions is the duration in months on the horizontal axis, and then the maximum unemployment rate that was attained on the vertical axis. You can easily see that these recessions cluster into two main groups. The first group, the larger group, is the shorter, shallower recessions. They last 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months maybe. They have a maximum unemployment rate of kind of mid-single digits, 6, 7, 8%. Not pleasant to live through, but not catastrophic either. Then there's this second smaller group, the longer, deeper recessions that tend to be more financially oriented in nature. They last longer, 16, 17, 18 months, and they're more severe. They have a maximum unemployment rate that's high single digits to low double digits. And then there's this coronavirus recession lurking out there. Even if I'm wrong on my projection, because I pegged it at 6 months, I tend to forecast quarterly and not monthly, but we haven't seen a recession shorter than 6 months in the US, so I felt a little sheepish marking it shorter than that. But for argument's sake, even if I'm off a month or two on that projection, positively or negatively, it's not going to severely alter the message that I'm conveying here. And the maximum unemployment rate, we might, keep your fingers crossed, maybe not hold your breath, but keep your fingers crossed, that we might have already hit the maximum unemployment rate, somewhere around 15 to 16%. Either way, you can see that this downturn is clearly an outlier relative to how downturns normally behave. Normally, there's a positive, and I say positive just mathematically, relationship between how long a recession lasts and how severe it is. This is unusual and different because it's short, but it is overly severe. And I've done the recession to check this out, the regression to check this out. If this had been a more normal recession, and I mean by that, followed this kind of trajectory that I'm showing you on the slide, and we got a maximum unemployment rate somewhere in that ballpark, 15 to 16%, then you would see a downturn, a technical contraction period in the economy of about 24 months. Think about that for a minute. 24 months before the economy stopped technically contracting. That is a scary proposition, because if the NBER, who is the ultimate arbiter of recessions, marked the beginning of this in March of this year, that means about 24 months later is March of 2022. So wrap your minds around that, because usually during recovery periods from recessions, you don't see job gains consistently until sometime after the technical recession ends, a quarter or two at least after the recession ends, which means in a more normal relationship between these two metrics, we probably wouldn't see any semblance of job gains until mid to late 2022. So if you're looking for a silver lining right now, that is what I would say is the silver lining, that despite the severity of this, which I am not discounting, not being Pollyanna-ish about, this could be worse, that this could not only be severe, but this could be prolonged. If there's any good news out of what we're going through right now, and again, keep your fingers crossed on this, it's that the data increasingly shows that this should be relatively short in nature, despite its severity, that we should start to turn more of the economy back on, see people start going back to work, see income start to rise again, spending increase. Not that I expect, again, all of that to come back in short order, but I do think that is a much more favorable view than the one that normal economics would typically dictate, which would be a very severe prolonged downturn, then a lengthy recovery back. So if you're looking for a silver lining out there, I would hang my hat on that. I think that's a pretty good bet at this point. Switching gears a bit and thinking about the longer term implications of this, because one of the questions I get asked about a lot is, okay, we're borrowing all this money for the government to fund these programs. What does it mean for us? And the answer is it kind of depends on the time frame that you look at. In the short term, probably not much. There's a pretty decent pool of research out there that says somewhere around 250% gross debt to GDP is where countries can maybe start to run into some trouble. And you can see even with my projection for the first quarter over on the right, which I've changed the color to show you that, even if I'm not exactly right on that, I'm still somewhere in the ballpark. We are way below that 250% threshold. That said, in the long run, if this persists and the trends on both an absolute and relative to GDP basis make me think that they will, we are going to have a serious reckoning about this at some point. We cannot play this debt game ad infinitum without it having consequences. And you can see just on this slide, relative to GDP, it's been going up since the 1980s, but on an absolute basis, the government has been borrowing since the early 1960s. There are only 4 calendar years at the end of the Clinton administration and the beginning of the W administration where the federal government actually ran a surplus. In all of those other years, they ran a deficit and they had to borrow money to finance that. So I will throw everybody under the bus for this problem because we have had all sorts of Congresses and administrations during that time. Democrats, Republicans, independents, farm animals, everybody has been complicit in this over the last 60 years. And at some point, some of those people are going to have to make some tough decisions about this, or we could very well find ourselves in a crisis that we would have to deal with. But for now, if this is keeping you up at night worrying about this, I would say don't. The medium to long run will have to address this. And it's not just a federal government problem. It's state governments, it's municipal governments, it's corporations, it's households. All of us have been drinking from the debt punch bowl. At some point, somebody's going to have to pull that away from us, and we're going to have to be a little more realistic about this. Thinking about some of the key risks out there, this is a version of a slide that I've been showing a lot for the last few years because I do think geopolitical risk has started to play a larger role. And I say that because I'm not the only person who has recognized this, but at least in my mind, geopolitical risk, especially over the last few years, has risen to a level that we probably haven't seen since, say, the end of the Cold War, the late 80s into the early 1990s. And I actually changed the title of this slide. When I thought we were going to have our big annual internal JLL meeting in early March, I changed the title of this and I called it, Are We in a Geopolitical Risk Recession? To be fair, I'm not sure a geopolitical risk recession is actually a thing. I might have just made it up. But in non-pandemic times, when I throw the R word around, it usually gets people's attentions and concentrates their minds. It's been a little blunted by the pandemic, but my point still stands. Are we actually in the equivalent of a geopolitical risk recession? And the images that I'm showing you on this slide just happen to be the ones that I think are concerning right now. What concerns me about this is the reason I see a geopolitical risk building is because in our short-term 2019, 2020 attention spans, we don't fix any of these issues. We just kind of capriciously float from one to the next. So we're clearly dealing with some of these issues escalating right now. Domestic political issues, you probably don't need me to tell you about. There's definitely unrest around the world. The pandemic forced people around the world to stay home for a while, but they are now back on the streets from Latin America to Hong Kong, and they're just as angry, if not angrier, about whatever it was that was bothering them before they went into lockdown. Brexit's still a thing. They're just kicking that can down the road. They haven't resolved that. If you haven't noticed, the United States and China are on the precipice of a Cold War. I think I would objectively argue that relations between the two countries are probably at the lowest point since the late 1970s. And then even a vaccine. Not that we all aren't sitting at home rooting for a vaccine, but depending upon where in the world it's discovered, that could create political tensions. If it happens to come from a country with a somewhat unsavory regime that prioritizes its citizens before sharing it with the rest of the world, or even just productive capacity. The idea that we need to vaccinate, I don't know how many, 6, 7, 8 billion people around the world, potentially requiring multiple dosages. How do you prioritize that? And how do you keep people who are not in the priority group from starting to protest and create unrest and get unhappy about it? So I'm not rooting against it. I'm simply saying, keep an eye on these things because a lot of these risks didn't go away. They got shunted onto the back burner because we were rightfully preoccupied with the pandemic. Now that we're either moving past the pandemic or, I don't know, getting bored of it, these things are getting pulled onto the front burner again, and they are starting to percolate a little bit. So keep an eye on these things because they don't necessarily have the outright ability to derail us. The way I think about them like wild cards. Sometimes you pull a wild card out of the deck, doesn't change your hand all that much. But sometimes you pull a wild card out of the deck and it substantially changes what you're playing with, and you stick around in the game longer than you otherwise would. The coronavirus impact was like that. I'm not saying any of these explicitly are, but we are dealing with a tenuous recovery at best right now. Keep an eye on them. They have the potential to be disruptive. And then there's this group of risks, which I classify as my key downside risk to the base case scenario. I think these are worth paying attention to right now. There's the risk of secondary lockdowns. I think governors are going to try to resist this, but as we're seeing hotspots pop up in different parts of the country that either didn't have lockdowns or didn't fully lock down, there's a risk that we have to go through secondary lockdowns at some point. Human behavior as well. And I'm not just talking about us, potentially causing these lockdowns. What I mean by that is if cases start surging, people could simply stop engaging fully in the economy out of fear of getting sick or because illness prevents them from doing so. As a fond of saying, you can shut down the economy by government order you cannot reopen it again by government order. So if people don't feel safe or healthy enough to go out and about, that will also impact the economy. And the last thing we have to be careful about is what I'm calling austerity. The idea that we think that the economy is getting on its legs on its own again and it's starting to grow, and we start to pull the support mechanisms out from underneath it. Kind of ironically, that could be the thing that maybe not derails things completely, but could cause headwinds to build. So keep an eye on that, because there's already some chatter in Washington about maybe not pulling back completely on the fiscal stimulus programs that have been approved, but maybe paring them back a little bit. So we'll have to keep an eye on these things, because depending upon how they evolve over the next few quarters will dictate whether we get something closer to the base case, maybe even an upside case, than something on the downside. Lastly, what does this mean for the major property types? I'm certainly not going to tell any of you about them. You are the experts. You know them certainly better than I do. But thinking about them from my economist hat for the 5 major food groups, there are 2 ways that I like to break down thinking about the underlying drivers of these types, the underlying thesis. The one component of it is cyclical. And I think it's fair to say, because it's been proven through multiple business cycles, that all of these major property types generally are pro-cyclical with the economy, meaning they perform better when the economy does well, and they generally perform worse when the economy struggles. I'm making a bit of a generalization, but I certainly, I've seen the data. I'm not going out on a limb making that assertion. I think what is potentially more interesting objectively and unclear at this point are some of the potential structural changes that could occur across these property types. And I don't necessarily want to go through each of them as a laundry list, except to say that these are the things that all of you in markets that you're active in Florida or elsewhere, will have to think about. What does it mean for people working from home? What does it mean if there's de-densification? What's the potential uses of flexible space? What tends to happen if companies relocate, stop relocating, use a distributed workforce, move to a hub and spoke type system where they have a central city center presence and then satellite locations out in the suburbs? I don't think anybody knows definitively any of those questions yet. I think there's a lot of conjecture about all of these property types with some of the changes that you're seeing, whether or not people are going to move out of city centers into suburbs and increase demand for housing in the suburbs relative to urban areas. Again, this stuff is to be determined, but in my mind, these are the interesting questions. These are the challenging questions that as practitioners in the commercial real estate space, you're going to have to grapple with and think about. And certainly as I'm trying to model the commercial real estate markets for the next few years, I'm certainly grappling with this. And I think it's fair to say that right now, channel my inner Donald Rumsfeld, there are too many known unknowns. What I would say is thinking about peering into the crystal ball, it's not so much that I think the fundamental thesis for any of these property types has been undermined. I just think they're going to go through a bit of a transformation, and they have been over time. Maybe it gets accelerated because of this particular downturn, but I don't think the underlying thesis for any of these physical spaces goes away. I do think we will probably have to reorient the way that we think about some of them, but that will be, that should be an objectively interesting challenge that we have to grapple with as we go forward over the next 3, 4, 5 years and see how some of this shakes out. But from an economist point of view, thinking about the underlying demand drivers and the underlying argument for all of these property types, I don't see them being undermined by what's going on right now. So a change at the margin, maybe. Complete destruction of commercial real estate as a viable asset class, that I'm definitely not buying. Definitely not now. So just a few takeaways. There's an abrupt slowdown, and I think that's because we got a shock to both demand and supply. Demand because we all stopped pulling back on spending because we either couldn't or were cautious about doing so, or we're just in lockdown and we just decided we didn't need some things. On the supply side, there are a number of people who simply can't work from home, so there's a lot that is not being produced right now. Again, the data will seem odd and unsettling probably till we get through the second quarter. I think thereafter you'll probably see things start to become a little more normal, whatever normal becomes, but that's my general expectation. So don't be too shocked by that. I think it's, again, par for the course. And then lastly, I think as long as we don't have any kind of severe backsliding on the health side, which again, I'm not an epidemiologist, but just trying to follow their lead on this, the duration should be relatively short, even if it's not the most spectacular recovery that we could possibly envision. With that, I will shut up and see if there are any questions that I I didn't address during this presentation today that I can. So I do have one question that has come in. So the first question that came in said, what in Congress and the states adopting laws immunizing landlords from liabilities, tenant to customers, and other safety concerns? You know, Mitch McConnell mentioned in the U.S. Senate, they mentioned in the Florida Senate. You know, I think that's an objectively interesting point, that they might actually have to go down that road. I think we are in the very nascent stages of re-engaging in the economy again. I think people are taking a little bit of a wait and see approach about some of this to see how precarious it is. I've heard stories anecdotally about people going back into offices in early stages of opening and then having to shut them down because of mini outbreaks or somebody who subsequently tested positive. I think there's not a lot of transparency on that yet, and I think it's something that both tenants and landlords are trying to, you know, groping around in the dark, feeling their way through about right now. I think if that were the case, then at least we would know where we stand on this, whether they agree to that or they don't agree to it. But I think right now, like a lot of the things that are going on, we are sort of groping around in the dark on this, and we're looking for a flashlight to give us, you know, a little more transparency, and we don't have it. I think, again, one way or another, not taking a stance on whether they should or shouldn't approve it. I'm simply saying, at least if we knew where we stood, then we could probably have a response that reflects that. You could see businesses making certain decisions. I think you'd see individuals making certain decisions. Until then, I feel like it just adds to the uncertainty that we're contending with right about now. I'm going to take a break and get a drink. If there's any other questions, feel free to type them in. I'm happy to address them. Ooh, that's a good question. Somebody asked, what new opportunities do you foresee in commercial real estate ahead, given sort of what's going on right now? You know, the way that I can maybe address that is, I have probably been more bullish on suburban areas than the average person has been for the last 10 years. And I'm proud to say that, because as somebody who publishes frequently, I can certainly point to things that I've written that are still out on the internet that make me feel confident in saying that, and I'm not straining my arm, patting myself on the back, but I always thought it was a little bit overblown, this idea that millennials were never going to own anything, and they were going to live in urban areas, taking their bicycles and or public transportation to their green open plan offices, where they were going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and be really productive. And I never fully bought into that. It always seemed like people were mischaracterizing what was going on. And I think you've clearly seen that not be true over the last 10 years. And to me, this is accelerating it. It's accelerating people who are on the precipice of making that decision to move out to the suburbs are certainly starting to do it more readily now. I think even businesses that once upon a time thought they needed to be, rightfully or wrongly, needed to be in urban areas specifically to attract talent, maybe that's not the case anymore. And as I mentioned, talking about van drivers, maybe we do move to a hub and spoke type system. Maybe
don't yell, guys. I'm going to be on, guys.
Maybe we do move to a format where we see a little more demand in suburban areas. So I have been generally bullish more on suburban areas than I think a lot of people have. Even on the office side, I've been not the biggest fan, let's say, of open plan offices for the last 10 years or so. I think you might start to see some blowback against that now, because I think one of the things that the research showed about it was that it was easier to get sick in open plan offices. And I think clearly people are rightly concerned about that. So I would not sleep on the suburbs. I was more bullish on them before than the average person. I'm probably even more bullish on them now than I was then. Oh, I got a question about how do I think the election will impact the economy? So there are two ways that I would address that. And I say this as a very apolitical person. As far as me projecting the economy, I try not to think about it in political terms. I try to think about it in policy terms. So in those cases that I was showing you, optimistic case, base case, pessimistic case, there are assumptions embedded in there, as I mentioned, about government policy, whether or not the government keeps spending money, what they decide to do about taxes, those sorts of things. So what I would generally say is, and again, it's a little in the eye of the beholder, if you think that policies are going to stay supportive of economic growth, then you would probably trend toward the more optimistic side. If you think policies are not going to support growth, then you would be pessimistic. The one thing I will warn you about, and I will say this again as an apolitical person, is I would say be careful about making assumptions about which parties are good for the economy and the stock market and which are bad, because I think the empirical research will show you something that's counter to the conventional wisdom. Again, I don't want to elaborate on that because I'm not a political person, but I would tell you a lot of the conventional wisdom and preconceived notions that people have about this is not actually supported by the data. And if you're sitting there thinking that's because other things are going on at the same time, I would say, yes, you are exactly right. And that is how you should think about it. And my response is there are so many things going on above and beyond government policy on spending and taxes and things like that that are more important to the growth of the economy, then I think that's the right way of looking at it. I got a good question about how Florida doing, specifically Tampa and versus the US in different asset classes. You know, I actually think, and I'm not saying this to pander to the audience, but I think other people who've heard me present down in Florida know that I'm generally a believer in Florida and the major metropolitan areas, that you are dealing with very significant changes in terms of demographics, with people moving in, changes in terms of business relocations. The one area that I think might be a little bit of a struggle for a while, and we'll have to see how the pandemic unfolds, could be tourism. Because if the outbreak persists and we don't have a vaccine or an effective remedy, then you will see some significant percentage of the population that is afraid to get on an airplane and stay in a hotel and go into restaurants and queue up in line at Disney World or something like that. But I don't expect that to persist in the long run. The idea that we are never going to get on airplanes and go on vacations again, I can't imagine spending the rest of my life never taking my kids to Disney World again. So to me, that is more of a temporary disruption than any kind of permanent disruption. I can't envision a world where people don't take vacations and participate in those sorts of activities. Aside from that, I think the underlying trajectory of Florida and those major economies is good. I don't see any reason why, because of this, for any of those to be disrupted. The job relocations, the integration of Miami into Latin America, all of those underlying, even in Tampa, right? The really good work that's being done with the university and research and the medical center. There's no reason to think that this should disrupt any of those things. So I'm still bullish in the medium to long run, even if we go through a bit of a disruption. Somebody asked the question, what about the comparison to the economy after the Spanish flu? What's really interesting about that is that when you look at the data on the Spanish flu, and admittedly back then, we only really have it annually and not quarterly, so you might have seen more disruption in the quarterly data, but you didn't really see a big disruption to the economy in the data from the Spanish flu, at least not on a year-to-year basis. Some of that's because we were coming out of World War I, and that was disruptive, and we rolled from World War I, and the economy started growing again, and then we rolled right from that into the roaring 20s before the bubble burst at the end in 1929. So I think it's a good comparison in the sense that I think the pandemic is probably of that severity. But one of the things that I think probably didn't happen back then, and there's some records on this, there probably weren't quite the widespread shutdowns and lockdowns. I think there was some of that back then, and there was a lot of encouragement on the part of governments and businesses for people to not engage. But I think you probably didn't see the kind of widespread lockdowns back then, at least not the way that we did today. So generally, I think there probably wasn't a lot of disruption, at least as far as we can see it in the data, but that might just be a consequence of specific policies that were implemented and the timing relative to World War I, because clearly that was a severe shock to what was going on. I got a really good question about what happens to shopping malls. My thought on shopping malls is that malls are like broad retail, are going through a serious evolution. And maybe this is more disruptive than we've seen in the past. But I'm not sold on the idea that people don't ever want to go shopping in a physical space again. I thought that was oversold after the last recession. I continue to think that's the case. I don't doubt that they will evolve as they have been evolving over time. But I think one of the things that we've seen in the data that makes me feel confident about that, or at least relatively confident about that, is if you look at the sales data for May, even in physical stores, it came roaring back across a whole swath of categories that people thought nobody was going to be interested in for at least months. Buying clothing again, buying electronics, buying sporting goods. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand right now for people who realize that that online shopping is not a panacea, that they've been dealing with it out of necessity, but they don't prefer it. And they would much rather, in some instances, be out in a physical store looking at something, touching something, trying it on. I think, contrary to the thesis, which some people said, which was this is going to make everybody conditioned to shopping online and they will never go back in stores again, I almost think more powerfully the opposite is true, that it's making people fully appreciate that you can't buy everything online, that it's not a perfect substitute for being in a store, and that people are undoubtedly dying to go out. And again, you saw that across different retail subcategories, which again, I would argue that 1 month doesn't make a trend, but I still think there's a lot of pent-up demand and people who would really like to be out in physical retail again, browsing and shopping. Oh, somebody asked a good question about supply chain disruptions improving or increasing in the short term. In the short term, unless you think that the outbreak really starts to spiral again, especially in Asia, I think we're probably past the worst of it. I think what gets more interesting is in the medium to long run, what happens if we decide that we don't any longer like concentration risk in the supply chain, that we think having one producer of an input to a final good or one producer of a final good, or maybe only a couple of them, is a concentration risk that the global economy maybe shouldn't bear. And I think even if that doesn't mean onshoring or nearshoring necessarily, you might very well see redundancy in the supply chain pop up, movement from China to parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, something like that. That to me, I think, is something objectively interesting that we will have to pay attention to, because I think given the disruption that we've seen, people have now opened their eyes to the fact that, especially for certain, I think what I would call security sensitive goods and inputs, pharmaceutical related inputs and products, semiconductors, things like that, that maybe it's not a good idea to have them concentrated in a particular part of the world. I got a question about thoughts on sporting events and concerts and large gatherings. That's one that might take a little time to get back to. Just because, as I mentioned, you can reopen up parts of the economy, but you can't guarantee that people will re-engage in those. It's not impossible, but my guess is even if those started to come back online, they would probably have to follow some kind of social distancing guidelines that I don't know if it renders them infeasible from a financial point of view. I think if you're talking about major sporting events, they make enough of their money from advertising revenues that they might be able to go back to limited capacity if they deem that something that they want to try. But I think that's a model that's going to have to be tested out. Anything like that, sporting events, concerts, big pinochle tournaments, whatever the case is, if they're really going to try to implement those again, my guess is they can probably start to do it at some point over the next year or so. But until we have proven vaccines, they will probably have to abide by some kind of social distancing guideline. I don't know what that means for, quarter full football stadiums or something like that. But I guess from a revenue point of view, 25% of revenue is better than 0% typical revenue. So I think it's possible. I think we'll have to see what the health experts say about that.
Hey, Ryan. Thank you so much. You were amazing. And I got to tell you, if Tom Brady coming to Tampa and we don't get football because of this, we can always look for pinochle tournaments. I don't even know what that is, but maybe we can make that an REIC event. We couldn't be more excited about NFL football, and we haven't been in so long since Tony Dungy and John Gruden were our coach. And now this is happening. So on top of everything else, right?
Well,
And by the way, guys,
maybe you guys could do like full contact mahjong or something. So
I don't even know what that means. See, once again. Hey guys, I apologize. I was yelling at my kids to stop yelling, except I was yelling at you. And that's the epitome of where we are today, right? It's either your kids or the dogs, or working from home is insane. But Ryan, we can't thank you enough. I wish we're going to ask you to come back live when all is behind us, because I would love to make this an evening event for our membership, and we got a lot out of it. I've been getting a lot of private messaging on my phone and online that this was great. So is Jeff going to join us to say goodbye, or Sherry, are you good for me to wrap it up?
Yes, you can
I'm
just
happy to wrap it up. Okay, guys. Well, thank you. Again, we canceled our shooting tournament this week, so we'll try to continue to create more opportunities for us to meet virtually. Ryan, thank you so much. Thank you for carrying the JLL flag. You make me proud. And anybody who has questions, we're going to share the presentation with everyone later on, so look for that. Thank you again, Ryan, and thank you for having your kids hold off on lunch while you spent time with us.
Anytime, I'm happy to do it. I look forward to being able to do it in person. I think as Julia can attest, I definitely joke around more and I'm funnier in person than on the computer, but I look forward to the fact that my jokes will not be completely stale by the time we can do this again in person.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.